Welcome to Challenging Paradigm X. My name is Xerxes, and in my podcast, I'm interviewing people who challenge the status quo. In this week's edition, we will talk about topics like, are we in a dreamlike state? Maybe something like a collective psychedelic trip? Is the current ecological crisis possibly the necessary crack in the eggshell on our way to collective awakening? Maybe a consciousness revolution, or even the next step in human evolution? And what is the power of initiation and why we need initiation rituals on a global level to solve the problems of the future? Today, my interview partner is Daniel Pinchbeck, renowned author and intellectual, who has written books on topics ranging from shamanism and psychedelics over bigger global transformational processes to the current ecological crisis. So if you're interested in these topics, I'm sure you don't want to miss this episode. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm happy to be here with Daniel Pinchbeck. So Daniel, introduce yourself with your own words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my name is Daniel Pinchbeck. I'm mainly an author, writer. I've written a number of books. My first book came out in 2002. It was called Breaking Open the Head. It was about psychedelic shamanism. Then in 2006, 2007, I came out with a book called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And then I did some other things. I was featured in a documentary. I helped start a company in New York called Evolver, which had a web magazine called Reality Sandwich. And we published a number of anthologies that I edited. But I didn't really publish the third book until 2017, I would say. And that was a book called How Soon Is Now, which was kind of looking at the ecological emergency from a system design perspective. And then more recently in September, I published a book with a woman anthropologist on ayahuasca called When Plants Dream, kind of overlooking the whole phenomenon of the global spread of ayahuasca. And I've been publishing just some self-published shorter essay books, one on kind of UFOs and aliens, one on kind of rethinking aspects of 2012, and so on. So, yeah.
Okay. So you've actually covered a variety of topics with your books. What would you say is why you do what you do?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I had like an existential emergency in my late 20s. Mm-hmm. I'd grown up in a materialist kind of culture. Like nobody I knew, believed in anything mystical or spiritual or religious. Mm-hmm. Everybody just thought consciousness was entirely based in the brain, and the universe was an accidental kind of phenomenon. Yeah. We were accidental parts of this accidental phenomenon. There wasn't really any meaning to anything. So ultimately, I had like a massive crisis of consciousness in my mid to late 20s, and then I remembered psychedelics and started exploring them again. And that opened me up. I had so many powerful, transformative psychic experiences. And I mean, another big issue for me from the beginning was, why are humans kind of out of control on the planet? Why do we seem to be destroying our own life support systems? Why is it impossible for people even to take that with the gravity and the severity of that it requires? Okay. So even when I wrote, Breaking Open the Head, the first time I went to the jungle in the Amazon in Ecuador, and I saw how fast the oil companies were, pulling it apart and toxifying it. And then, so once I went through these kind of, it's a long answer, I guess. I don't know.
Just, you have time.
I went through various initiatory experiences. I visited the Bwiti in Gabon taking iboga. Yeah. And visited the Sequoia tribe community in Ecuador to work with ayahuasca, and visited the Mazatecs in Mexico. And I began to have a lot of psychic experience, paranormal experience that seemed linked to undergoing this kind of initiation, which is what many of these ancient texts talk about. So I began to really come to the conclusion that there was more to this whole like indigenous cosmology, shamanic worldview, occult perspective, that actually had to be taken very seriously. And that our denial or repression of the psychic and spiritual and occult aspects of reality had to be somehow part of this multi-dimensional crisis that's been unleashed on the planet. So then once I developed that perspective, then I looked at the 2012 book. I looked at the prophecies of cultures like the Maya and the Aztecs and the Hopi, and also the Yuga cycle of ancient India, and kind of the prophetic traditions of the monotheistic religions, which everybody seems to be pointing towards this time as this culmination or this threshold of transformation, and either it's
even in the monotheistic
well, in a sense, I mean, in the U.S., many fundamentalists believe that we are in this sort of apocalypse time, and they're actually trying to accelerate the exact conditions that are described in the last the Book of Revelation or whatever. But even from a Jungian perspective, like Carl Jung believed that the archetype of the apocalypse, as he called it, was constellating in the human psyche in the 20th and 21st century.
Okay. So would you also call that spiritual emergence in your late 20s, you said, as like the first turning point of your life? I would be interested how you think this type of spiritual emergence has an impact, why it happens in someone's life, and which impact it does have on the rest of a life, and in this case, in your life.
Sure. I guess, one question is whether one believes in things like karma and reincarnation and so on, and whether spirits or souls have evolved in different ways and different. So people could go through exactly similar conditions as I went through, but not then come out of it with a longing to connect with some deeper truth, but for whatever reason, it was my combination of my psychology and karma, and I guess I had some inklings because my mother had been part of a group of writers and artists called the Beat Generation. And she'd been involved with Jack Kerouac, and I knew Allen Ginsberg growing up, and they were actually in the 1940s after the Second World War, they were all in the circle around in New York or at Columbia University. And they were just trying to figure out why there was spontaneous expression of human individuality in their culture, that everything was kind of constructed, and they felt there was no consciousness. You listen to politicians or to academics or whatever. So they decided they had to sort of excavate their consciousness by whatever means necessary. So that included, experiments with sexuality, experiments with, drugs, with, journeying like hobos around the world and so on, to break through the sort of constraints and the structures. And that really, they were big inspiration for the hippie movement in the 60s. Yeah. But so basically one of the main things about the Beats was that you really couldn't trust any experience unless you had it for yourself. So really believe in direct experience, transmission of consciousness, spontaneity. And I was working in the media and in magazines and so on, and most of the people I knew were really not into that. It was more about the sort of second generation perception through the mediation of the culture, and sort of in jokes, cultural. I don't know. It's just the idea that you would actually go out and excavate, truth for yourself, or try to find something essential, or have these types of, which is not very, now it's more popular in the culture. Yeah. And now in the last 15, 20 years, I think there's a lot more emphasis on that, partially because of the growing popularity of psychedelics and, for other reasons.
Okay. So when you compare your development to your mother's development, for example, would you say it's in a way, or it was a way of connecting on a different level to the experience they made when they were growing up, or do you think it was actually somehow a experience of questioning everything you have done in your life before? You see what I'm
I wasn't trying to copy their experience. It was more like they gave me the
or building on it,
the inspiration, this idea that, because I look at my friends who, were in different circumstances than I am at that time, and who didn't end up, going to Africa and taking iboga, going to Ecuador and taking ayahuasca. And some of them ended up dying of heroin overdoses and so on, because they got very depressed. But I think having that connection to the beats, and this notion that you really could only, it's very, it's the same idea you find in Gnosticism, whatever. You have to open the door for yourself. Nobody else can open. The fact that somebody else opens a door doesn't mean anything to you. You have to go and do that for yourself.
So in a way, it was a continuation of your own path, but influenced by what you have seen from the generation before.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, and generations before that. I mean, I think it's a lineage of Gnostics, Romantics, alchemists. the underside of the Christian capitalist juggernaut.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And well, I mean, for example, a lot of people I know around Groff, for example, they believe like in the spiritual emergence as being this one-time event that kicks off a lot. In your personal experience for your life, was that like the one turning point in your life, or later on in your development you felt like there were different turning points as well that have also influence on the work you do today?
Well, I mean, there definitely been a number of turning points, but that was probably the most significant. I mean, then in writing the second book, the 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, I was researching the Maya and the Aztecs and Jungian ideas of the apocalypse and all these other things, and then had a transmission experience of like a voice that announced itself as the voice of Quetzalcoatl, giving me this prophetic transmission over the course of a week.
Okay.
So that was like a channeling experience, which I didn't believe in, and even maintain skepticism even in the book, but that was quite transformational also.
Yeah.
And then when I was starting my company in 2006, I really thought there was a way to rally people cleverly to kind of put together a new cultural paradigm to kind of address the ecological emergency. And now it's been another turning point of the last few years. I'm very sort of like pessimistic in a sense. I feel like and maybe there wasn't even time back then, but I feel that we may have really missed the boat and maybe but then you have to see that as like an evolutionary. That was just what happened. That the effects of what we're doing to the planet are far outracing now our capacities to awaken and restore the balance.
Okay. So, because you said now you have like a little bit of more pessimistic outlook, how old were you? When was it when your first spiritual emergence took place?
It was like Saturn return, 28, 29, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, 29, 30. The head came out when I was 35.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And like after that, you feel you had a much more positive vision of the future?
I mean, I was certainly very excited, because I really was fascinated by the idea that this 2012, the way the Maya points to 2012 as this culmination of this long cycle, and the work that particularly Jose Arguelles did about that in his book, like Earth Ascending and the Mind Factor, that we might actually have like a breakthrough or like an uplift to a level of collective consciousness, kind of what Arguelles talked about as like the activation of the noosphere. Yeah. And and McKenna, Terence McKenna, who's another major psychedelic figure, talked about it as the singularity or the eschaton. So I didn't necessarily think that those things were going to happen on or around 2012, and they still very well might happen. But I definitely felt that it was fascinating that this ancient culture was pointing towards this time when we really could see it as such a crescendo in terms of the effects we're having on the planet, the rapid evolution of our technology, the meeting of all the world's mystical traditions and so on. But I'm sort of, I don't know how well versed you are in this material or how interesting it is to you.
I'm very interested.
Like Graham Hancock had written this book, Fingerprints of the Gods, and he found all this evidence all around the world that they were looking towards 2012 as he thought as a physical catastrophe, like there would be like massive flooding or a comet would hit the Earth or something, and his book was a huge bestseller, and then none of that stuff happened like that. But then I'm thinking maybe we're actually the comet. Like maybe what these ancient traditions saw was the end of a cycle, the culmination of a process beginning at or around that date. But that cycle is something that ultimately leads to a world that either doesn't contain humans at all or contains like very, very few of us in much more precarious circumstances. I mean, and I still think there's the hope. I mean, that's what How Soon Is Now is about. That we can see that we're going deeper into an emergency, right? Like Australia, massive fires, 1 billion animals just died in Australia. The Arctic, 65 degrees Fahrenheit, warmest by far that it's ever been. Things melting like crazy. The ancient methane that's frozen in the Arctic is now releasing, and we're seeing like basically the winter here was like spring the whole winter. Exactly. So things are actually accelerating faster than the worst predictions of a few years ago. Yeah. And then you have like, whether it's the Pentagon or like the, different institutes issuing reports that, it's looking quite possible, but there wouldn't be human civilization, certainly as we now know, it won't be possible by 2050. But even that could happen even faster than that. I mean, considering the acceleration and all the feedback loops. Yeah. So, but it could still be that this is something like the necessary like cracking of the egg. I mean, there is like there's this strain, particularly in American thought, of like conscious evolution, like Barbara Marx Hubbard. Yeah. This idea that maybe what's happening is we're undergoing something like a caterpillar into a butterfly metamorphosis, and we're in the sort of pupation stage where within the cocoon, the caterpillar is like devouring like every last piece of resource, and it looks like it's all done, but then it's going to emerge into another form. So it could be that there, and we can see that, for instance, we do now have a global communications infrastructure where anybody in the world, except maybe in China, will be able to see your podcast, as soon as you put it up and so on. So theoretically, that could be utilized as a kind of very, very rapid, learning machine for humanity. Yeah. If, for instance, we realized that we all had to stop consuming fossil fuels and compost and, grow food. I mean, all of those skills could be taught, through the internet. Yeah. And, we have 3D printers, whatever tools that people needed could be made. So it could be that the whole thing that we've created is, setting us up for this sudden collective awakening. Yeah. And that would be amazing. But the other possibility, and then even if we had, huge catastrophes like floodings and droughts and everything, maybe we could still cobble it together. But we, basically eradicate the nation state boundaries, the current financial system, forget all of that. We would need to use, potentially blockchain or whatever to construct totally different ways for people to, communicate, make decisions together, apportion resources and so on. So that it could be that this whole capitalist system is just like on the verge of, breaking down. But if we have enough of that creative and technical understanding and initiative, even in that breakdown, maybe we can actually construct, this other thing that would actually work for humanity. Yeah. Yeah. So that's one, I can look at the different avenues. One is we just go extinct. Yeah. One is we have this incredible breakthrough and we decide to all work for the human family as a whole, everybody's benefit. And another is, smaller enclaves of wealthy people, maybe handfuls of indigenous people in like the mountains of Peru will survive and everybody else is just going to go down in flames. That almost seems like the most likely one, but I do see the range of options.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you mean. So basically, when we look back, it's now 8 years since 2012 have passed. So, I mean, when you look at big shifts happening, then it could be that it actually started and it's just taking some time. Because when we look at, for example, like the Industrial Revolution, it took 100 years to fully evolve. So it could be that a new cycle started in the way that you perceive it, but we're going forward so quickly.
Sure, I think that we're in actually, a very different reality now than we were, 10 or 15 years ago, and even 8 years ago. I mean, obviously, the Trump presidency is an unbelievable, kind of phenomenon. Now we see the historical parallels to the rise of fascism and Hitler and so on. But, there's something about it that feels almost like dreamlike. It does almost feel like since 2012, there's been a shift in the human psyche, and it's almost like more like we're on this collective, psychedelic trip together. Yeah. Everything is highly intensified, and a lot of people feel the amping up in different ways. Nahuatl tradition, which is the Aztec tradition, there's a guy called Sergio Magana who's written a book called The Dawn of the Sixth Sun. Okay. And he says that their view of it from the Aztec Nahuatl lineage is that 2012 to 2021 are actually the transition from what they call the age of the fifth sun to the age of the sixth sun. Okay. The fifth sun, which was the last 5,200 years or whatever, was a sun of light, and we're moving into a sun of darkness. Okay. And that's their characteristics. But the sun of light means a time when human consciousness is more focused on, daylight, clarity, waking, rationality, reason, science, technology, and so on. As we move into the sun of darkness signifies like the dream world and the psyche. So actually, in a sense, we're going back into something more like a dream, like a lucid dream reality, where manifestation happens faster, but where our thoughts can be very destructive and can go. So I think that is really fascinating because it does feel like something like that is happening. Although when you over literalize it, it can also seem kind of ridiculous. But if you kind of just kind of I've done a lot of work trying to understand how to approach kind of occult and esoteric cosmologies and concepts and so on, and it's like a little bit different than just scientific evidence. You have to approach it with a kind of intuition, imagination, kind of artistic perspective also.
Okay. And the other scenario was, and you've talked about this also in the past, I think, especially in the 2012 book and also in your last book, and you mentioned it now about this collective shift. This is also something I always talk about, that then what you say, and maybe you want to talk a bit more about this, like that we don't have rituals in the Western culture anymore, what that means for us. So what I've always say is that we need a collective mind shift, which would perhaps mean the next step in human evolution as well. And at the one hand, we have this challenge, which we could call the physical challenge with our environment going south, and then the other challenge also being artificial intelligence. We don't know if it will be able to have a real consciousness and what that would mean for us. So how's your take on this issue of consciousness shift and initiation phases us as humanity?
Okay, sort of like how in most cultures there's some kind of initiation.
Exactly, and what it means, the situation we have at hand right now as humanity.
Because we haven't, in our culture, because this whole idea of there being like other dimensions or layers of perception have been taken away.
Okay.
So, when most normal people think of initiation, they think it's like a cultural event, like, that's cool, the Indians go and like dance with feathers, or somebody stays up all night, and but actually, Joseph Chilton Pearce wrote a book called The Biology of Transcendence, and his argument in that book is that actually, the part of our brain that makes us most distinctly human, I guess, is the prefrontal cortex or whatever. That's only evolved to its present state of complexity relatively recently in the last few 100,000 years, and that although it's working and it matures to really properly function, it needs like a secondary shock from outside, preferably in like late adolescence or early adulthood. Otherwise, without that secondary cultural shock, which can also happen naturally through an accident or something, or war or something like that, then there's a sort of, it's hard to escape the egoic individual self. So that's why these cultures design these initiations where you would undergo some kind of training in, visionary or transpersonal experience through, walkabout or fasting or fire walking or, visionary plant shamanism. And the idea is that you would, once people had gone out and seen into the spirit realms a little bit, then they were able to be sort of welcomed back as mature adults into the community. So in a society like ours that doesn't have that, people, particularly men, but it's for both sexes, but maybe men particularly, often never become mature in that sense. They're always after their own self-interest. And that's what we see reflected in our failing institutions and so on.
And the situation we have at hand with the environment forces us maybe to go through like a ritualistic phase where we get to a next step of, I would call it human evolution, human consciousness. Maybe you call it in a different way. Did I understand your work?
I think so. Correct? I mean, in the Breaking Open the Hat, I talked about Walter Benjamin, who's like an amazing German Jewish critic. And he noticed that like the First World War, maybe that was like, because of the loss of initiation, that no matter what, humans have to undergo some experience of what he talked about as commingling with the cosmic powers. That can be done through ritual, creatively, which we see like in efforts to construct those types of rituals and like the transformational festivals like Burning Man or something. But if it doesn't happen through some culturally constructed ritual, then those same forces will often get unleashed destructively through wars or genocides or whatever. So those forces get bottled up. And in a way, like obviously, like, we knew about, the ecological crisis since the 60s, and, we even knew about greenhouse gases, and, we didn't know maybe it was going to go this fast, but we knew that we were, pushing the limits way back when. Why haven't we been able to deal with it? Well, it's almost like we've been, forcing this situation, like forcing a crisis circumstance, where we either bring about our own evolutionary metamorphosis or we die.
And which paradigms you think need to be challenged for a better future?
Yeah, well, I don't think that we can survive with this current capitalist economic system.
Okay.
And I have a lot of friends who are kind of, conscious or green entrepreneurs. In fact, I just talked to a friend yesterday, and he's starting a new company which is trying to figure out how to monetize the growing of like 1 trillion trees around the planet. And I don't know, I just have a dubiousness around this effort that you see now, people trying to squeeze profit out of the
Green.
Ecological emergency. So that's the big issue. In a way, like in How Soon Is Now, I talked about this Italian political philosopher Antonio Negri, and his definition of capital is ultimately capital is a social relation. Which basically means it doesn't really exist. It's something that we've reified. If somebody owns $1 billion, what do they actually own? They own legal documents. They own data that's swirling in the digital banking system and so on. So we've it's just that humans have made a social relation where we've defined that person gets to control all of that value. But it's ultimately an imaginary construct of the mind, right? So what we really would need to do would be to rethink from the ground up how we create value, how we ascribe value, and then really only allow kind of value-based activity has to be stuff that is supporting this transition right now. And that it would be kind of draconian in a way, but we're definitely going to hit the skids if we keep doing this.
Okay. So to sum it up, it would be basically the paradigm of capitalistic economy needs to be challenged, profit-oriented or shareholder.
Yeah, it's a design. It's a system design thing that has been going for a few centuries, and it got us to this point. It was extremely efficient. It did all sorts of things for us, but it's now in direct conflict with continuity. Our survival.
Basically. Okay. Do you have ideas, or are there people you feel like they have good solutions that you see that you would like to point out?
Yeah, obviously in the U.S. there's the Green New Deal. I think that's a great idea. Rather than, that's still within the current paradigm of the dollar-based economy, but rather than creating these huge deficits and handing it to military to build more weapons of torture and surveillance devices. Why not, if you're going to create money out of nothing anyway, fund a, just transition to a sane, ecologically regenerative society. And, then we do have lots of, scalable solutions that could be, exponentially implemented. Finding the juncture of like indigenous techniques and, contemporary technologies. Even there, it's quite possible it's too late, to be honest. In terms of how, the curve of what's happening, particularly with the methane, CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for about 100 years. Methane is something like 30 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas than CO2. So it only lasts in the atmosphere for like 10 years. And that's what's bubbling up, in the Arctic right now. And so what you often have in the extinction record in the past is these periods where like tons of species go extinct in a short period of time. That's probably because you have this massive eruption of the methane. And so suddenly you have 6-degree warmer climate in a decade. And, every organism has evolved to fit into certain niches. And then, and then the other issue with the warming is we lose the tropical forest. We're losing the forest right now. We lose the plankton in the ocean. So that produces, plankton produces 60% of our oxygen. Forests produce 20% of our oxygen. So then what's producing our oxygen at that point? I don't know. But anyway, so the hopeful point would be to, really turn humanity's direction in focus in this direction. And yeah, I mean, you could have, global tree planting projects every weekend, reforestation projects, people learning on a handcraft level how to, work organically with bees and so on. Like we can do what we can to, stop and reverse the damage. But at the moment, we're accelerating in the wrong direction. Yeah. In terms of the economics, I think it would be a blockchain-based system that would ascribe value to, ecologically regenerative systems.
Yeah.
And then you would, your profit would be based on how much you are enhancing, contributing to those systems. And if you're removing from those systems, then you're penalized harshly, which is the opposite of what we have now. At the moment, with the capitalist economic system, you have externalities.
Yeah.
So corporations don't have to pay to pollute. I mean, even like you're shooting me with all this lovely gadgetry from Apple and so on. Every 6 months or a year, they make people who need to stay on top of this stuff buy like a whole new thing. Yeah. It's full of rare minerals, conflict minerals, minerals from Africa. I mean, 4 million people have died in Cameroon or whatever because of genocides around conflict minerals to make these iPhones. These things could be built so they're component based.
Yeah.
So you don't replace a whole model as soon as it goes down. But they've made them as slick as possible, as seductive as possible. It's part of the capital system based on planned obsolescence and conspicuous consumption, which is what drives the profit margins for these companies.
So, how do you think this system could be changed? I mean, politics moves very slowly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had hopes for the Extinction Rebellion movement, but now it doesn't feel like it has enough traction to me. Okay. I think that any movement that starts, whether it's Occupy or Extinction Rebellion, it's like a hyper, what an occultist would call like a hyper sigil. Yeah. So it attracts certain types of energies to it. Yeah. And in a way, I liked Extinction Rebellion because it was like super punk rock and was kind of like, how to sort of fuck the system energy and so on. But I think that we need a hyper sigil for a global movement that is extremely utopian and super positive. And also, for me, as I said, like I've gone through, mystical and psychic experiences. So I know that there is a deeper story to the nature of reality, that we are like, woven into the nature of consciousness itself, that, the world we're experiencing is sort of consciousness having a dream or telling a story to itself. Yeah. We're all part of that story. I think that actually there is a new paradigm that can be defined that is based on the, kind of precise integration of science and mysticism. Yeah. Quantum physics and Vedanta and so on. And that provides a sound basis for people to feel that their lives actually have meaning. Yeah. And that actually they can sacrifice material excess to contribute to something that will bring them evolution on like a spiritual and soul level. Yeah. So that for me would be, but I tend to doubt that there's time, because I feel people have gotten so imprisoned in, they've been, the indoctrination of the, media and the sort of, commercial ideologies, that's why I've been fascinated also about the psychedelic renaissance as, could at least provide people those direct experiences where they have insight that, there's a bigger story going on, and that, it often can change people's focus faster than other things. But on the other hand, even that I'm also beginning to have questions about, because I feel that it's being kind of domesticated into the, entrepreneurial capitalism system, rather than being seen as something that can deprogram people from that whole system.
How do you mean the last thing you said? That it's being domesticated?
Yeah, well, it's like microdosing is now seen as like something that you give to Google engineers because it makes them more productive. The same thing that happened with mindfulness. That the capitalist machine is incredibly efficient at assimilating anything different, anything threatening, absorbing. It's sort of like, like a metabolizes. It like absorbs whatever it can use, and everything else gets ultimately kind of like shunted to the side.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I've never been at Burning Man, and you've been a lot. But what they always say is that there you find all the big heads of the Silicon Valley companies there as well. Why is it not happening? Because they have most power. They have more power perhaps than the American president. So why is it not happening that although they go to Burning Man, most of them definitely have experience with psychedelics? Steve Jobs himself, he said it was one of his most profound experiences.
Right, and he had no problem tormenting teenage workers in Asia and stuff like that.
So this is my question. Well, what do you think? Why is it not happening, although these people are making these experiences?
Right. Well, so I don't think that psychedelics by themselves make you, an empathic and enlightened soul. And in fact, they can be used for power and so on. And also, I had high hopes for Burning Man a while back, like in Breaking Open the Head. I was very excited when I first went. But over time, I feel that, once again, it's this assimilation process. There was kind of like a tension between kind of a, anarchist, hippie, let's save the world, kind of radical spirit, and more of a hedonistic libertarian ethos. And I feel that over time the hedonistic and libertarian ethos has triumphed.
Yeah.
The Burning Man has 10 very interesting principles. Leave no trace. Nobody's a spectator. Everybody's a participant. Etc. But it doesn't do anything. It leaves the question of like social inequality and wealth kind of out of the table. So essentially, Burning Man becomes a reality defined by the wealthy people, who are the ones who build the giant stages or the big art cars, and people gravitate to the spectacles of these things that cost. So it really, in the end, has just replicated kind of the dominant culture. Yeah. It's like instead of having yachts, you have art cars. And that liberational spark, I feel, has now been assimilated into something. It's still better than there not being a Burning Man. I have gone there and had really amazing conversations with people at the peak of the pinnacle of these different professions and wealth holders and so on. And and once again, what's going to be most interesting to see is what happens in the next few years as this crisis ratchets up and intensifies. Yeah. Because some super wealthy people may decide that they're going to. I already know some move to New Zealand or develop underground bunkers or something, but that's not a sustainable solution either.
Yeah, it's not a solution. No. Okay. My final question is really, what would you like your legacy to be, in the sense of what impact would you like to leave behind with your work?
That's an interesting question. I don't really think in those terms. I just wanted to. I grew up in a literary culture. My mother was a literary writer and editor, and so when I grew up, the idea was to create like a book, like a literary icon that would last generations and so on. Now I feel that the pace of transformation is so quick, and what we're going towards maybe is so different, that I'm just trying to figure out how to help the most, be of service in the process. Definitely I feel that, being humans on the earth, we're in an interesting, kind of exciting situation. It's like an incredible, video game, movie, holographic projection that we get to experience. Yeah. And certainly it would be more interesting and exciting to see a positive evolution and, to participate in that. Yeah. Whereas, what we see now is kind of, it's like grim. We have like people in the US who now are like hating on black people again and, storing guns, and, China is like, mind controlling everybody and, making it so they can't even like, step out of line, and they lose all their privileges or whatever. And that's probably going to, transfer to other cultures that are similarly repressive. We could move into a totally totalitarian, repressive paradigm combined with total ecological breakdown. Yeah. That would just be disgusting. Yeah. Whereas we could also move into an awakening into our like true nature as, divinities, unifying our human family and, using our creativity, what we can learn from indigenous cultures and what we can take from modern technologies. We need to like definitely be more discerning and careful about how we use technology, and then kind of re-engineer our planetary situation to be like enduring, heaven on earth kind of a situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the interview. Thank you for staying tuned for this edition of Challenging Paradigm X. If you like this episode with Daniel Pinchbeck, feel free to share it with your community so his message gets spread even further. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me or write into the comment section. And next week we're up with the next episode of Challenging Paradigm X. So until then, I wish you a great week and say ciao.